John chapter 2 tonight, Jesus' first miracle. Now, if you notice on the screen behind me, you'll have several places where it's recorded in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and then sometimes not John. But the next few lessons we're going to talk about is only found in John. John is the only gospel writer to record these events that we're going to talk about for the next few weeks. But this first one is a very important one for several reasons, because he begins to remove the veil, if you will, a little bit. He's lived in obscurity for the most part, at least as far as we know. And he has been baptized. He's gone to the wilderness to be tempted. And now he's gone back to his home area. And now we're going to find him at a wedding feast. Let's turn to John chapter 2. Let me just read verses 1 through 12. And then we'll make some comments about this. On the third day, there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee. And the mother of Jesus was there. Now both Jesus and his disciples were invited to the wedding. And when they ran out of wine, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." Jesus said to her, "Woman, what does your concern have to do with me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Whatever he says to you, do it." Now there were set there 6 water pots of stone, according to the manner of purification of the Jews, containing 20 or 30 gallons apiece. Jesus said to them, "Fill the water pots with water," and they filled them up with water to the brim. And he said to them, "Draw some out now, and take it to the master of the feast." And they took it. When the master of the feast had tasted the water that was made wine, and did not know where it came from, but the servants who had drawn the water knew, the master of the feast called the bridegroom, and he said to him, "Every man at the beginning sets out the good wine, and when the guests have well drunk, then the inferior. You have kept the good wine until now." This beginning of signs Jesus did in Cana of Galilee, and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. After this, he went down to Capernaum, he, his mother, his brothers, and his disciples, and they did not stay there many days. Now, when you realized what we were going to this text today, what's one of the first things you think of when you think about the water being turned to wine? What do you think we'll say most people, maybe not necessarily you, but when we talk about the miracle of water turned to wine, what do you think most people think of? What's the number one question, do you think, that most people want to know? It wasn't alcoholic. Was it alcoholic? Was everybody, you agree? You hear that a lot? Let me just say, we'll address that. But that's one of the most unfortunate things, in my opinion, that happens when it comes to this text. Yes, it needs to be talked about. Yes, it needs to be dealt with. But remember what we said at the beginning? Does this teaching, is it the main point, or is it something in the peripheral of this point? And so sometimes we can spend so much time discussing that question that it takes the importance off of what's really important in this. And we'll talk about that. I don't believe that it was alcoholic wine. But let's not just only think about that. Let's read this text and let's think about other things than just that in this text. We do not know who's getting married in this wedding feast, but Mary was already there when Jesus and the disciples came, which indicates that she was probably pretty close to this person, maybe even a relative to this person, to the family. And not only that, but she was enough to cater to their needs. And so, who is missing in this? You have Mary, you have Jesus, and then later on, his brothers went with him to Capernaum, and his disciples. Who's missing now? Joseph. We don't know exactly what happened to Joseph, but most presume that he died sometime between when Jesus was 12, because he was there with him, and when this wedding feast takes place. Most people, he assumes, has died by this point. The Bible says nothing about that, and so that's all we can do is wonder if that is what happened. Those from the disciples who have been following John just a few days ago, and I like to think about these types of things, and we probably did this last year, especially as we were reading this text 5 days in a row. But if we can use our imagination, I was reading something this week, and was talking to Tom about this. When we read the Bible, just like we do with any other book, part of when we read something with just words, with no pictures, what are we automatically doing in our mind? You're making pictures. That's exactly right. You're making a picture in your mind of what this looked like. Sometimes you're right, sometimes you're wrong. I don't know if you knew, if you guys are familiar with Chris Collinsworth. Probably a lot of you are. He does football, Sunday night football, and he played for Cincinnati. Well, I never remembered seeing him when he played, but he was on 700 WLW, which is a radio station out of Cincinnati. And he was popular on there for years before he ever made it on the national scene. But I listened to that station a lot, and I would listen to, he had like a 3-hour show, and I listened to him. And for some reason, I pictured him. This sounds funny now because I know what he really looks like. But he was a short man. He was bald on the top and kind of overweight. This is what was in my mind. And then when I saw him the first time, I thought, I couldn't have been more wrong. He's the opposite of everything I imagined. And I went all on that just by his voice. So, of course, sometimes we can be wrong about this. But as we read the Bible, we paint pictures in our minds of what this looked like. So imagine this wedding feast. Let me just give you a little bit of background. Again, what do you think of when you think of wedding? You probably think of a nice church building. And you think probably about a bride in white and a man maybe in a tuxedo, and the bride's family sits on one side, the groom's family sometimes sits on the other side, and everybody's very quiet, everybody's prim and proper, everybody gets there on time, the wedding starts on time, and everything is just hunky-dory. However, weddings back in the Bible times, they were not just a 20-minute affair. They would go on for days. And so this has been going on probably for days, this wedding feast. And during this time, the family hosts everybody who comes to this feast. And the reason I know this is because in India, their wedding ceremonies are still very much like that. It's not just one ceremony. It's several days worth of ceremony. People still go home and sleep or sleep there on the grounds or whatever. But we went to an engagement, and they said, you're going to be speaking. They tell me that. I said, okay, I've never spoken at an engagement before. What do you do? They said, oh, just preach. I said, whatever I want. Yeah, just preach a sermon, whatever you want to preach. I said, okay, that's what I'll do. But as I preached, there's probably about 600 people in this big banquet hall. This is the one Mindy and the girls were able to go with as well. In this banquet hall, the bride comes in at first. Then they take her out, and the groom's family washes her, and then they put her in a change of clothes that they brought for her. In other words, those old clothes belong to your old family. This is just the engagement now. Here's this new set of clothes. From now on, you're part of our family. And so the wife will move in oftentimes with her husband's family and really becomes part of their family. But as we're up there speaking, there's several of us up there on the stage. Everybody's talking. People are coming in and out. Children are running around. It is nothing like anything I'd ever seen before. And that's just the engagement. And this will go on for days. And it's just a big, big celebration. And all this time, the family is the one that has to feed all of these people. And so it's a big deal. And it's that shame culture where if you're going to invite everybody, that it's up to you to provide for all of those people. And even still today in India and other countries as well, if you would run out of food or drink, that would be a more shameful thing than we can even imagine with us. If we ran out, what would we do? Well, just go down to the dollar store and get a couple of 2 liters, to deal with it. No. That's not how it was during this time. The husband's family would pay a dowry to the wife. And, you're taking our daughter, so the least you could do is make this feast, make it worth us and everybody, all of our friends and families, while to come to this feast. So that just paints a little bit better of a picture. Don't just think of a little organized, and you got the preacher standing up there, the bride and groom, everybody else is seated and quiet. This is a feast that would last several days. And so, imagine, I say all that to say this, it's not just food, it's not just a buffet for one day. It's several days worth of eating and drinking. All right, so the disciples, who had they been following just a few days prior? And we didn't discuss this, but John chapter 1 talks about it. They had been disciples of whom before they were disciples of Jesus? John the Baptist, that's exactly right. So they had been hanging around each day with John the Baptist. What did John the Baptist eat? Somebody remind me. Locusts and wild honey. Now, so you go from that, and what's the first thing that Jesus does, seemingly according to Scripture, with these new set of disciples that are following Him? The first place He takes them is to a wedding feast. What do you think those guys are thinking now? Say, man, this is more like it. I'm tired of eating crickets and any honey that we can find. This is more like it. And so watch where they are. And I can just imagine what that would be like after following John for a while. But I want you to also notice that you don't picture Jesus here. He's not pictured here as eating and being comfortable and celebrating, although we're going to make some points I think that are important. He was more interested, of course, in providing a spiritual feast. Cana is about 9 miles north of Nazareth and was the home of Nathanael. John chapter 2, verse 12, or 21, chapter 21, verse 2 tells us that. But think about this, now that we've read it, still in the introduction. You think about the first act of any public figure that he's going to do. We usually put some times of importance on what they do, the first thing that they do. And it can really set the stage for how things are going to go. Not always. You can overcome a bad performance, or you can go downhill after one good performance. But this is how he's going to start. He's going to set the tone and set the stage for the next 3.5 years of his life and his disciples' life. So there was a marriage with that wedding feast lasting several days. Just like they did in India, there would be a washing of the bride. As I said, there would be a dowry paid. There would be a gift from the groom. She would become a part of the husband's family. But notice that Jesus went to this feast. When you picture Jesus in your mind, walking on this earth, and again, I will tell you, we paint a picture every time we read something, every time we think of Jesus, we put a picture in our mind. We don't necessarily always think in words. We're painting pictures in our mind. And so, if you looked at Jesus in your mind, what do you picture Him as? Do you picture Him as someone who always just walks extra holy? I'm not being blasphemous here. I'm just asking you, how do you picture Jesus? Do you picture Him, somebody tells a funny, clean joke, and Jesus, I don't have time for nonsense. If one of His family is celebrating something, do you picture Jesus as, all this food, all of this celebration for just one wedding, I don't have time for this. Is that how you picture Jesus? Jesus went to this feast. He went to this wedding. Was Jesus a sociable person? What does it say about Him? Jesus increased in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and man. How do you increase in favor with man? You mix with them. That's exactly right. You mix with them. You talk with them. You interact with them. And so Jesus was here at this wedding feast. And so when we think about Jesus, when he was on this earth, yes, he was perfectly holy. Yes, he was perfect in every single way that he could be. But he also had times of celebration. He had times of special times with family. This is who Jesus was. Just like we do, he did. It says the mother of Jesus was there, and Jesus was also invited. Tenney suggests that the word carries a slight connotation that Jesus and his followers were extra guests. They were invited because Mary was there. And again, this is what you see. Could you imagine if you were getting married or one of your children was getting married, especially if you are the father of the bride and have to pay for it? Yes, I know something about that. So you have the meal planned out, and then extra people start showing up. Yeah, can so-and-so come? Nope. Nope, they cannot. Hey, do you mind if I bring my ailing grandmother who hadn't eaten in 3 days? Nope, she can't. But now, here comes these extra people. And that would mortify us. But I tell you, in this time and in this culture, these are the types of things that would happen. And so it's very possible, I think Tenney is onto something when he says that because Mary was invited, they were maybe perhaps some extra guests because Mary was there. But not only did Jesus approve of marriage, but by his attendance, he does something else. Does anybody know anything about the Essenes? We know about the Pharisees, we know about the Sadducees, but there was also a group called the Essenes. And they hated anything that had to do with anything physical. They were completely opposed to marriage. Completely opposed to marriage. So by Jesus being there, what is he saying to the Essenes already? It's okay to be married. So Jesus was there. On the third day, verses 1 and 2, there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Now both Jesus and his disciples were invited to the wedding. Now verse 3, and when they ran out of wine, the mother of Jesus said to him, they have no wine. Jesus said to her, woman, what does your concern have to do with me? My hour has not yet come. The fact that the wine ran out, as we've said already, it might not mean a lot to us. Oh, say, I'm sorry. We're out of wine. Would you take water instead? Oh, yeah, it's no problem. It's no problem. Would you take a Coke instead? Sure, no problem. It doesn't really matter. There are other things here to drink. But in this culture, remember we talked about history and culture? In this culture, this would be a devastating thing, an embarrassing thing, not just to the groom, not just to the bride, but to the entire family. This would be a very shameful thing to happen. Now, why did she go to Jesus, do you think? And here's an interesting question. Why do you think she went to Jesus? You've been up here reading my notes. If you didn't hear that, what Miss June is saying is that the Scripture tells us that when certain things would happen, she would put them in her mind. She would keep them in her heart. And Dan says he's the problem solver. You think she had seen anything up to that point in her life to indicate that he's the one to go to? Yeah. Why go to Jesus? I suggest that she was expecting a miracle. And I start with what Miss June just said. She had treasured in her heart and her mind already some miracles that had been done surrounding Jesus. How about his birth? You think she kept that in her heart? Well, we know that she did. When the wise men came and the shepherds came, it says she kept these things in her heart, and she knew she had never been with a man, and yet she was with child. She had seen the angel. So she knew. Sometimes we look at Mary and think, oh, she had to be shocked when Jesus did this miracle. I think she was expecting one. How about the foresight that he had shown when he was 12 years old. They marveled. And remember what it says at that point. She kept all these things in her heart. Yeah, that's a good point. What's that mean to her if she didn't know? Yeah, that's a good point. Actually said he wouldn't have said my hour has not yet come if he didn't think that she knew. That's a good point. Number two, something of the wonderful happenings at his baptism must have been known to her. Remember what happened at his baptism? The Spirit descending like a dove, lighting upon him. We had the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit all involved. All three of whom are involved in our lives. Number three, Jesus' disappearance for so long a time would have worried her when all of those things had taken place. Number four, his reappearance with a group of followers suggested that he was about to really begin his ministry. You know, he had been gone. He had gotten these followers. He shows up with these followers. She knows something is going to be happening in his life. And then number five, if she expected the supply to be replenished by natural means, why approach him at all rather than the servants? If we're going to go down to Piggly Wiggly and get some more, then you wouldn't talk to Jesus about it, would you? No, you just say, hey, servants, we're out. Let's go get some more. But who does she go to? She goes to Jesus, the problem solver, and the one that she has seen miracles surrounding already before. Then Jesus uses a word that is an affront to some today. How does he address her? Woman. Woman, what does your concern have to do with me? Let me read you something. Again, we're reading the Bible in our time. This time, when Jesus addresses her, well, let me just read what Johnson says, and then I'll make some comments on that. He says, the term woman was so respectful that it might be addressed to the queenliest, and so gentle that it might be spoken to those most tenderly loved. So you would say it to a queen. It's so respectful and so gentle that it might be spoken to somebody that you dearly love. Now, how do we know that he meant it respectfully? How did Jesus address his mother from the cross? Remember? He looked at her. Woman, behold thy son. Behold thy mother. Put her in the care of John. He loved her. It's a tender saying. It's a beautiful saying. What does your concern have to do with me? My hour has not yet come. There's a question as to what this means, my hour has not yet come. Well, we know he talks about his hour later on in the book of John as being the time when he's going to go to the cross. I don't think that is it at this time. But the hour to where he publicly comes out in full force and shows people who he truly is, that hour has not yet come. This is a little bit, it's at a feast, it's in a particular location, although it's going to get out, no doubt about that. It's going to be published abroad. But my hour has not yet come. But then, he goes ahead and performs a miracle. He goes ahead and performs a miracle. Because look at verse 5. And this shows you that she didn't take it as a slam against her when he said what he said. Look at verse 5. His mother said to the servants, whatever he says to you, do it. She didn't think, well, man, he really told me off. I'm not going to ever ask him to do anything again. When he addressed her in that way, she turned to the servant and said, whatever he tells you to do, you do it. You're getting ready to see something really neat here. Whatever he tells you to do, you do it. She wasn't put off by Jesus' answer. And the commands that Jesus was about to give, why would she have to tell the servants? Now think about that. These are servants. They are there to serve. Why would they have to be told? We're out of wine. And what's Jesus tell them to do? How do you make wine? You just fill up these water pots with water to the brim. Don't leave room for anything else. Why would you have to be told You just do what He tells you to do. Because it's going to seem so ridiculous, so unreasonable. When He tells you what He's getting ready to tell you, don't question it, just do it. Just do it. And she was more than just an ordinary guest, wasn't she? Because she's telling the servants what to do, isn't she? Look at verses 6 and 7. Now there were set there 6 water pots of stone, according to the manner of purification of the Jews, containing 20 or 30 gallons apiece. Jesus said to them, fill the water pots with water, and they filled them up to the brim. And He said to them, draw some out now and take it to the master of the feast. And they took it. It was already wine. Instantaneously, it was already wine. That water turned to wine in those water pots. Did Jesus touch these water pots at all? No. What did He do? He just told the servants, they got the water pots, they filled it up with water, they drew it out. Why do you think that was important? There's something up my sleeve. You watch this. I'm going to put a little grape juice in there, and I'm going to make them think. I just turned on. No, He never touched them, did He? They did it. They took it out. They took it to the master of the feast, and it happened instantly. Instructed them to draw it, take it out to the master, and if it had been what kind of water pots were these? I just gave the answer. Watch it again. Now there were there 6 water pots of stone. Were these wine pots? Water pots. So in other words, there wasn't a residue left in these wine pots. What were these pots used for? Purification purposes, washing purposes. They were for water. So there had never been any wine in these things. And now this water turns to wine. And then look at verses 9 and 10. When the master of the feast had tasted the water that was made wine, and did not know where it came from, but the servants who had drawn the water knew, the master of the feast called the bridegroom. I wonder, as I read this, what those servants were thinking. And this is going to be interesting because I just filled this up with water, and then I take this out, and now it's purple. And I'm going to take this to the head honcho and let him taste it. And I'm going to be the one that gives it to him. What would you be thinking? Yeah, it's not going to. This could go really, really bad. This might be my last day on the job and my last day on the earth. But here he goes. They take it to him and he tastes it. He didn't know where it had come from, but the servants knew. And look what he said in verse 10. And he said to him, every man at the beginning sets out the good wine, and when the guests have well drunk, then the inferior. You have kept the good wine until now. Whatever conclusion this ruler might have made was based on first-hand experience. Notice that. This wasn't I heard over in Africa, that's always where it happens. Over in Africa, they raised this guy from the dead. And so I believe. The master of the feast has no idea the source of this wine. Yet what does he say about it? This is the best. He had no idea that it had been made from water. First-hand experience. If the Bible taught that modern-day miracles still occurred, and I saw one, I would believe, wouldn't you? And even if the Bible didn't say anything about it, if I saw that, I would believe if I could see it firsthand. This man saw it firsthand and did not know the source of it. The water had become wine. Instantaneously. He didn't recognize the source, but he recognized the quality. Fermented wines during this time, when we think of wine, we think of of course, as we would, you go out and there's a bottle of wine that you buy. The wine that is sold today would be considered strong drink back then. It would be, we consider wine and beer to be rather mild drinks. But back then, the alcohol content in our bottles of wine would have been their high alcoholic content back then. Fermented wines were, like I said, unlike our modern day wine. It was already weak in its initial state, but then it was diluted with 2 to 3 parts water. 2 to 3 parts water. And had no intoxicating qualities unless you drank gallons of it. Now, they did have strong drink. That's not what was made here. They turned water into wine. So, even wine that had been fermented would have been weaker than our modern day wine. It would have been weak in its initial state, and then it would have been diluted. You might say, well, they didn't have refrigeration like we do have, and so it would ferment. But what they would do is dilute it 2 to 3 times. New wine was the fresh juice of the grape. You remember the wineskins? He talks about that. You don't put the new in the old wineskins. That's right. This new wine would be fresh juice. Wine that was boiled, thereby stopping the process of fermentation. They also had that. Foster says this, we're out of time. There was no sign of drunkenness recorded in the text. The man who tasted it was not drunk. And how do we know that? Because he knew it was good. He knew it was good. If he couldn't stand up straight, it would taste just like all the other wine. I want to close with this. And this will get us to think about this next text that we're going to study next week, Lord willing. This is the beginning of the signs Jesus did in Cana of Galilee. And manifested His glory. Now watch this next part. And His disciples believed in Him. Think about that phrase. They're following Him. But where do you think their faith is right now? Do we see it weak at the beginning of His ministry? And then do we see it grow? Absolutely we do. How about you and me? Are you where you want to be spiritually? Or do you have a ways to go? Was Jesus patient with His disciples? Will He be patient with me? Key is to keep growing, isn't it? All right. Next week, we'll talk about turning over some tables and stuff. It'll be fun.